Great. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Erica Satin-Hernandez, who will get us started and reintroduce ARPA to everyone in attendance.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Erica. I'm the ARPA specialist with the city of Somerville. And I'm really excited that you are all here tonight so that we can review some of what we've been hearing from the community engagement process so far. Next slide, if you will. So tonight we're going to review a quick overview of ARPA and just a reminder on the legislation. We're going to talk about what the city has committed so far in terms of ARPA funding. Then MAPC will give us an update on the community engagement process and what we've heard so far, which includes both analysis of our community survey, as well as some qualitative feedback from focus groups and meetings. And then we'll go through next steps. Next slide, please. Thank you. So MAPC uses these group agreements to ensure that we have a great and productive meeting. We encourage you to take a read through these quickly and keep them in mind as we roll through the meeting. So our City of Somerville staff who are working on the ARPA project. I'm the ARPA specialist. The director, Austin Faison, is here tonight as well. We've also got a Somerstat analyst named Sam, who is working on the team. And the finance team is made up of Kate, our finance director, and Sharon, our finance specialist. And clearly in our partnership tonight, we're working with MAPC to complete this community engagement process. And these are the members of their team. And I'll bring on Emily now to introduce them and what MAPC does.
Thank you, Erica. We are very excited and happy to be a part of this process.
Can't hear you quite yet, unfortunately, Emily.
What is it? Can you hear me? Okay. We are really happy to be a part of this process to support the City of Somerville's community engagement. We have these folks that are on the team, and tonight Christian will be presenting as well. Gloria is also here as well. And next slide. We are from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. It's the local regional planning agency to Massachusetts Metro Boston area. We support 101 cities and towns in all kinds of regional planning. And so we're providing this technical assistance. Christian, do you just want to hit next slide? There we go. This is the area that we support. And our mission is really to promote smart growth and regional collaboration. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for this overview. And we'll do a quick review of ARPA. Great. So ARPA stands for the American Rescue Plan Act. And this is a federal legislation that is bringing funds dedicated to COVID recovery efforts to states, counties, and cities. And so municipalities and cities like Somerville are receiving these funds, and Somerville in particular it will receive $77.5 million in funding for these COVID recovery projects. And so ARPA funds can be spent in a number of different ways. And primarily, those include, of course, public health efforts, combating the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. That can look like direct to household assistance, like food programs, rental assistance, and otherwise. Serving the hardest hit communities. We know that COVID has not impacted all of our communities equitably and equally. And so funding can also be spent towards making sure that those who have been hardest hit by the pandemic have the services that they need to recover from those impacts. There's also an opportunity for premium pay for essential workers, again, written with equity in mind and prioritizing our lowest income workers. the opportunity for recovering lost revenue for municipal governments. And finally, infrastructure updates around water, sewer, and broadband systems. And so in terms of timeline, ARPA funds can be obligated until the end of calendar year 2024 and spent until the end of calendar year 2026. But that extended deadline does have some specific caveats, which we can't reallocate funds towards different projects once we pass that 2024 timeline. So any projects that continue those 2 extra years really need to have a very fixed budget. Most of the projects that will probably fall into this category will be very large projects like the water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure projects. And so the city to date has committed just about $10 million to different ARPA projects in these key categories that we've discussed. And so this is a list of a representative sample of the ARPA project titles that have been committed to date, grouped in some of the categories like we mentioned previously. And so in terms of public health, looking at emergency management staff to make sure that the city can provide cohesive service, rapid test distribution, in particular for the hardest hit communities, working with SOIA, the Somerville Office of Immigrant Affairs, to distribute rapid tests, looking at community outreach workers and hiring. I know I see some are here today, so thanks for being here and thank you for all of the amazing work that you're doing to get the word out about ARPA and help us get the community feedback that we'll be presenting today. And for the big ticket items, one you'll see here, the child care tuition assistance program, we've put some of the dollar amounts so you can get a sense of how things fall. And so there have been a couple large youth services projects, definitely basic needs, looking at various housing support programs, food assistance programs. We're looking at a pilot for universal basic income, which is still in the planning process, but really excited about that. And an engagement center for people experiencing homelessness in the city. And finally, of course, administration in making sure that we have the staff and the capacity to make sure that all of the projects are well made, have all the reporting requirements that we need to go up to the federal government and make sure that the funds are used in an optimal way. How will the city choose projects? There are 4 key elements that we think about when we're looking at what projects move through the process. So the public portal for proposing projects will be open later in the spring and summer. And when we are moving projects through the approval process, we look at the public feedback, the community engagement findings that include what we're present today, but we're going to continue that process. And so, understanding what the community would like to see will factor very strongly into how projects are chosen for ARPA funding. If there's emergency need, particularly, and of course, given the topic around the pandemic, if there's something emergent in terms of public health or otherwise, the eviction moratorium as an example, as a deadline, these are elements that will come into the decision-making process as well. Is the project, shovel ready? Is it ready to get started once funds are made available? Or is there, a longer lead time in terms of planning process? And then finally, if there are other priorities that have been identified through any of the other, processes that the city and the community has gone through, thinking about summer vision, thinking about other needs assessments in our area. And we also, like to make sure that we all know that the federal guidelines require that all projects get final approval from the mayor. So our team is here to gather community feedback, to coalesce that into a package that we can give to the mayor to help make her decisions, to work with applicants to make sure that they've got a great full proposal that's the best it can be. And then we move it through the process to make sure that all the projects come up to the mayor with all of the information so that she can make a final decision. Thank you. So that's a quick review on ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. I'm going to hand it to Christian, who will give us a review of what we've seen so far in terms of the community engagement process.
Great, thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. My name is Christian Brandt. I am the Community Engagement Manager at MAPC, like Emily mentioned earlier. I'm also a Somerville resident. I see some familiar faces here today, which is really exciting. I want to just preface what we're about to what I'm about to go through and just mention that this is really a point in time assessment of what we've heard so far. We have other additional engagement scheduled to keep gathering feedback, but we really wanted to take this opportunity to sort of describe what we've already heard to date. So I think you can think about this as sort of like mid-process review, as it were. It's certainly not the end of the process. There's going to be a lot more stuff happening as well, and we're going to hear from more folks. But this gives you a sense of the type of things that we've heard to date. So I just want to quickly sort of, before we dive into the details of the engagement, I know this text is a little small, but we started this project with a presentation to the City Council back in September. We had our kickoff forum where we really sort of like brought everyone who was in attendance onto the same understanding of what ARPA is, because it is a huge undertaking that covers lots and lots of different topics. And so that was in October. And since then, we have been working with community organizations in the city to schedule focus groups and meetings with local providers and constituents. We also released a community-wide survey from January to April. And now we're having this sort of like ARPA update forum. We're going to continue to do some of the engagement work that we've already been doing. And we're going to expand that work to make sure that we're addressing some of the gaps that we've noticed in our engagement work so far. And I'll go into what some of those are at the end of the engagement part. So to date, we've engaged with, we've had more than 15 focus groups, over 40 total meetings with local stakeholders. We had over 12,000, not 12,000, that would be incredible. We had over 1,200 participants in the community survey, and each question had between 800 and 900 responses on average. We also were collecting feedback through the somervillema.gov/ARPA website, which had an interactive budgeting tool on it with a comment box, and that tool generated over 150 budgets and almost 50 comments. I think somewhere like in the neighborhood of 47 comments. And so all of this information we sort of brought together into one place so that we could really read through the qualitative feedback that we've gotten so far. And also, this presentation will be put up onto the project's website. So if you are worried about capturing some of the information that's in it, it will be available for you to look at afterwards. And of course, I think the recordings, I said this earlier, but the recordings will also be made available. So I just want to quickly go over some of the questions that we asked in the survey that had some quantitative responses. And this text I also know is small, especially if you're joining us on a mobile device. But essentially, the question on the left is, have you used any relief or assistance services during the pandemic? Select any that apply. 74% of the people who responded to the survey indicated that they hadn't needed to use any of the services that we listed, which included the SFLC clothing closet, the Office of Housing Stability, public assistance like DTA or food stamps or SSI, for instance, childcare assistance like vouchers or food pantry or something like that. Among the relief or assistance services that we included, the item that had the most, that was selected the most often by participants was actually not something provided by the city. It was public assistance, DTA, SSI, or food stamps. On the right, you can see a very similar question, and that is, since the start of the pandemic, have you had trouble accessing any necessary resources? And people could select any or all of the options. 42% of people said that they hadn't had any trouble, but there were some three sort of main areas where people had trouble accessing resources, and those were mental health care, medical care, and jobs or employment. So these, I think, sort of give us a little bit of a picture of where participants in the community survey, at least, were coming from when they responded. So this is sort of like one of the sort of core questions of the survey. And it really focused on the broad funding category, or broad categories that the Arpa project came to us with. So these categories that you see down at the bottom are categories that were provided by the federal government. And so we asked people to pick up to 3 categories that they wanted the city to prioritize funding for. And I think it's worth noting that these categories have a lot of possible uses under them, like many possible uses. And this is just kind of like the 7 big buckets which the federal government sort of used to structure some of the way that people could spend funding. So the one that had the most amount, that was selected the most often, was serving the hardest hit communities and families. And then sort of the one that was selected the least was replacing lost public sector revenue. And then in the middle, the other categories all had sort of a similar ballpark number of respondents selecting those. So we also collected demographic information from people who responded to the survey. And I just want to note now that I'm going to come back to this at the end of the qualitative analysis section, because this was really informative for us in terms of how we should adjust our engagement to make sure that we're connecting with folks from all different parts of the city. So the sort of spread of ages and incomes is relatively close to what the spread is in Somerville based on the census. And so the 2 categories that had the most number of responses in terms of age was 25 to 34 and 35 to 44. In terms of income, the sort of response category that had the largest option was a household income of 100,000 to 149,999. But the other categories, that one had the most, but a lot of the other categories were also pretty close to each other as well. And then in terms of this household size, the majority, or at least a small majority of people who responded came from 2-person households. In terms of the race and ethnicity of respondents and the user language, which we were also able to collect through the survey, 73% of people who took the survey identified as white. And then you can see that the next largest category that people selected in response to this question was Hispanic or Latino. In terms of the user language, 92% of people who took the survey responded to the survey in English. And then much smaller numbers of percentages of people took the survey in responded to the survey in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, and Nepali. And I'll note that it says 0 under Nepali, but there were some responses in Nepali. They just are not very significant. And I'll return to that in terms of a number. I'll return to that in the end of the presentation. So this image is unfortunately a little blurry. So we'll make sure to update this in the presentation that we upload to the website so that you can actually see what it says. But this was a screenshot taken from the project website, and it is a screenshot of the budgeting tool. So this is in reference to the 150 budgets that people submitted through the website. And what you're looking at is an average of the allocations that people provided to those 7 categories that we'd asked them about in the survey. So the category that received the most amount of money on average in the budget was investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So this is sort of like one data point for us to look at when we're thinking about where people want to prioritize their spending. A close second was serving the hardest hit communities and families. And then some of the other categories had close, but about 10% on average less of an assessment than those top 2. So I want to get us into the qualitative analysis because this is, I think, where we're really getting into the needs and wishes of people who took the survey. The methodology that we used to do this was that we basically took the open feedback questions from the survey, the open comment question from the OpenGov project website, and then our notes from the different focus groups that we've done. And we uploaded them all into a database that we could use to identify themes and categorize responses by those themes. So in doing this, we identified a handful of themes that are relatively analogous to the categories that ARPA has created for funding, but I'm going to go through them and just sort of discuss some of the things that we heard. The order in which I have done this is not based on a frequency. There's no particular order to how these themes are listed. So I just wanted to mention that before we get into it. So the first theme is community and school-based projects. And this is somewhat of a catch-all for a bunch of common themes that we heard that didn't fit nicely into some of the other themes, but were still really important. So one sort of like big overarching theme in the feedback was that people really felt like the city needed to better integrate the services that exist and that it provides already into the broader Somerville community and make sure to provide support for accessing and using those services. So a couple of major sub-themes here stood out in terms of what people were looking for. They include to expand and support a spectrum of different childcare options, including before school, after school, and summer childcare options. There was a lot of folks who suggested funding a universal pre-K program for Somerville residents, improving school facilities, especially regarding ventilation. So you can already start to see how these theme areas are somewhat intersectional with some other things like infrastructure, for instance, or support for families, and so on. So you might notice as we go on that some of these are relevant to some themes are relevant, things that we're finding in some themes are relevant to other areas of this work as well. Lots of folks wanted the city to think about providing support for teachers in the school district and other vital school programs. Building a community center came up a lot, and I'll just sort of note here that what I mean by building a community center includes feedback that we received that was also wishing for a youth center, wishing for a senior center, wishing for a community engagement center for people in Somerville experiencing homelessness. And then some folks sort of commented generally that they'd like to have a community center of some sort. Improving interpretation and translation services was also part of this theme that came up pretty commonly. And then improving connections to services and help with existing services was definitely a sort of overarching theme that appeared in a lot of the different engagement opportunities that we hosted. I wanted to also include some actual quotes from people that we heard from our survey. And I know that this is a lot to read, and I'm going to pick one off the page, but they're here for your viewing if you want to look at them now or later. But one thing that really stuck out to me in this was this comment. We have to spend almost $50,000 per year to provide childcare for my 5-month-old and my 2.5-year-old. We have a good income, but this expense is making us live paycheck to paycheck. So this is the type of feedback that we received that indicate to us that childcare is a big issue that people are looking for the city to provide support with. You can see on here that there are some other pieces of feedback about childcare and investing in after-school programming for students and resource connection as well. One of the other really big themes that we saw consistently across a lot of our feedback sources was housing, generally speaking, which I know is a very broad category, but there were two really specific things that we heard again and again, and that is that housing affordability is a huge problem in the city, which I don't think that comes as a surprise to most people who are here. And displacement was a huge concern that often was mentioned in the same comment as housing affordability. So in that sense, a lot of participants who were responding in this regard saw them as connected. Some sort of within that umbrella of topics, we heard some really specific things as well, such as people needing assistance paying rent or paying utilities, especially if they had lost sources of income during the pandemic. Assistance with housing instability, if people are sort of living paycheck to paycheck or dipping into their savings because they might have lost a source of income. There was a lot of people who responded to the survey and to the OpenGov website who really wanted the city to invest in a diverse type of, like providing different kinds of affordable housing, not just affordable rental, but also affordable home ownership, and expanding the types of mechanisms that the city would use to produce this housing and who might be eligible for it. Really focusing on strategies, housing strategies that can prevent the displacement of current residents. And then lots of folks sort of in the same context, especially as developing diverse affordable housing types, really felt like the city could use this as an opportunity, use ARPA as an opportunity to develop housing that was targeted towards specific community groups like new immigrants or service industry workers or teachers or stuff like that. Those were all suggestions that came through in the comments. And then lastly, we heard a lot in this topic, we heard a lot about the need for legal assistance for housing issues such as eviction. So those were all sort of themes that came through in this area. So again, I wanted to sort of highlight some comments. These are sort of a sampling of things that we've heard from folks. So one person who took the community survey indicated that we need anti-eviction and direct rent support, anti-eviction program, excuse me, and direct rent support for economically vulnerable communities. And then a lot of people shared a very similar sentiment to one of the comments that you can see up here on the screen, and that is our most pressing local issue as a community is housing affordability. I'll note that oftentimes when people were leaving comments that connected to housing affordability, it was framed as an urgent matter, which again, I think isn't necessarily surprising to folks who are sort of experiencing that in their daily lives. All right. So a next major theme, and this is really sort of like combining two big themes that I think are really interrelated, or at least seem very interrelated based on what people were talking about in the feedback. That is transportation and infrastructure, but especially transportation infrastructure. Say that 3 times fast. These all really came up a lot in folks' comments. So some major transportation themes included expanding public transit, specifically bus and train, but also piloting free or subsidized public transit, and a few participants pointed to other municipalities in Massachusetts that have started to do that or have thought about it. We heard a lot about the accessibility of parking, especially for people who can't take public transit or walk or bike because of mobility issues or another reason, and needing to have options for that group of Somerville residents. And then additionally, we heard a lot of comments about improving the existing transportation infrastructure and maintaining it. So roads, intersections, sidewalks, bus stops. And in this category, people had really specific comments where they mentioned particular intersections, particular roads. I think, you know, if your neighborhood is like my neighborhood, we have the neighborhood pothole. So people had lots of experience in this regard to share. And then we had a few suggestions about piloting car-free zones in key locations. And I'm off the top of my head, one particular location that came up a couple of times was a car-free zone in Davis Square, and sort of seeing what that would be like for residents. And then I realized I skipped over improving bike and pedestrian mobility in the city as well. Major infrastructure themes that don't relate to transportation really connect to the infrastructure categories that are identified by the federal government for ARPA expenditures. So that includes expanding and subsidizing broadband access, but specifically publicly accessible high-speed internet for the city. Ensuring that buildings that currently exist in the city, and also buildings that are new or newly being developed, are upgraded to be energy efficient, including city buildings. Improved lead abatement programs for residents within the city who need to update their homes to remove lead. Separating sewer and stormwater infrastructure, expanding stormwater infrastructure to prevent flooding. And then another part of this, which there were only a few comments that were very specific to this, but it also came up as part of many other comments, was prioritizing infrastructure improvements in areas where either underserved communities lived or communities who have been historically discriminated against or excluded from these types of processes exist, and also in public spaces. So this the public spaces comment includes updating things in public parks like trash cans and water fountains and things like that, and making parks more accessible to all kinds of Somerville residents. So some of the comments that will help illustrate what people were sharing with us is, please, we must invest in public health measures such as transportation equity, including better permanent bicycle and mass transit infrastructure, so more people can commute, get to the doctor, get to school, and get around town. One person said, this seems like an opportunity to greatly invest in the backlog of water and sewer infrastructure, and with it, the streetscapes, so that they can be safer, more walkable, and more bikeable. The next sort of big swath of feedback that we heard, I've sort of grouped under the umbrella of economic development. I will note, before I sort of get into some of the major themes, that in this area of feedback, a lot of people who responded indicating that economic development strategies were something they wanted the city to pursue, also expressed that local businesses especially, they felt that local businesses especially had been severely impacted by COVID-19, and were really broadly interested in identifying ways to spend ARPA money that would provide support to address that impact. And so there were two main areas of assistance that people sort of focused on, and those were workforce and employment assistance and small business and nonprofit assistance. They're very related to each other, of course, so they're not necessarily separate entities, but I have separated them here just to facilitate a deeper understanding of what people have said. So with regard to workforce and employment assistance, we heard a lot about people wishing that the city had some way to help them learn technology or access technology. This especially was connected to needing to be working remotely because of the pandemic, or especially to education, needing access to technology to participate in educational opportunities as well. So in addition to that, lots of, I realized that the third bullet is actually 2. I apologize about that, but lots of people wanted to develop training programs specifically for youth, so that they could be prepared to enter back into the workforce for the first time, and at the same time address some of the impacts on their education and development that might have happened because of COVID. And then the bullet that is accidentally included in number 3 is workforce and employment assistance programs that are really specifically targeted to new immigrants or undocumented residents or residents who don't speak English, and really facilitating a connection to workforce opportunities and employment for those groups of people. And then at the same time, a lot of commenters felt like this was an opportunity to couple workforce development and employment assistance with other identified ARPA priorities like infrastructure expansion or assistance for senior residents in Somerville. And I'll get to some of that later on in the presentation, but that was also a theme that came up a lot here. With regard to small businesses in the city, one of the most frequently occurring themes that was related to small businesses was the desire and hope that the city would make some of the COVID related assistance programs permanent. And this includes some of the financial assistance programs that small businesses were able to access, but people also focused on expanding or making permanent the use of streets and outdoor spaces for outdoor dining, especially, and really wanting to see that continue as an opportunity for local businesses. We also heard a lot, especially from some of our small business owners themselves, about providing marketing and digitization assistance and helping businesses get more accustomed to working in or investing in the type of infrastructure they would need to be able to have an online presence. Providing assistance for nonprofits in the city to help maintain their efforts, especially when it comes to supporting the staff that they need to actually carry out their missions. And then in addition, providing targeted assistance to specific kinds of business owners like BIPOC-owned businesses. And then we heard a bunch from folks who wanted some targeted assistance provided to businesses in East Somerville. So some of the pieces of feedback that we heard in this category included the city could come up with something in the high school to train students who might be interested in supporting seniors, but also providing other types of care within the city. This comment that I'm about to point out came up a couple of times actually, and that is about capitalizing on the Green Line extension with a sort of advertising campaign for businesses that would draw people from the Green Line extension in Union Square and later to the spur that goes into Medford, to spur economic development and tourism and other interest in Somerville. So the next large area of feedback that we heard was the desire for direct financial supports to residents. There were 2 main categories of this feedback, and that was, or main themes, excuse me, and that where it was sort of general direct payments to residents, but then also premium pay to essential workers. So I'll talk about both of those. But I just wanted to note that a lot of people in this who had comments related to this theme were really clear that this funding could be used to address some of the financial hardship that that people in Somerville, residents and essential workers, had experienced, but also, especially when it comes to premium pay for essential workers, a lot of the framing was around thanking them or respect or using this as an opportunity to support the risk that they took on during the pandemic. So some smaller themes under this are providing the local equivalent of the stimulus checks that the federal government provided, developing a universal basic income program, which Erica mentioned earlier, providing local unemployment assistance for COVID impacted workers now and into the future, providing targeted supports that are specifically designed for Somerville's low-income residents and community members, and then of course direct pay to essential workers. And then under that umbrella of direct pay to essential workers, people frequently included healthcare workers, service industry workers, and school staff. But there were also other frontline staff that people included as well, such as public safety and fire. And then in addition to sort of direct payments to essential workers, lots of people were also really interested in using ARPA funds to improve the salaries of those workers and not just sort of treated as a one-time payment. So under this umbrella, some of the comments that we heard were provide basic income directly to residents to make their own decisions how to address their own needs. And then another sort of representative example of this is essential workers went and still report to work every day, leaving their families to care for everyone else. People were still able to get food, medical attention, crisis intervention, and basic help. This is sort of indicative of the framing that a lot of people used when they were responding to this, to the survey opportunities. So moving on, public health, of course, was a major category of feedback. There are lots of things that people talked about under this category, but I wanted to pull out a few major themes that came up again and again, and those are the continued testing, tracing, and support of vaccination programs within the city, especially in communities that have low vaccination rates, and then sort of connected to that, the continued provision of PPE for local businesses and residents. Another major theme that came up again and again was providing or expanding access to mental health services for residents. And I can sort of, I'll just mention now that my partner is a mental health clinician within the city. And so the frequency at which this theme came up also is indicative of their experience working in the city as well. I would say that mental health, even though it's here under public health, it really came up in a lot of the comments across all of the other themes as well, but especially relating to school and educational settings and teachers. So that is a major area of concern for Somerville residents as well. And then in addition to that, addressing food insecurity and generally expanding access to healthy foods, connecting residents with health insurance and other medical care, especially in the instance when residents might have lost their source of employment. And then this sort of came up a number of times, and it's a little bit specific, but it came up often enough that I included it in this list, and that is creating a new non-emergency medical response team that doesn't burden our existing public safety infrastructure, such as the fire department. So by that, what I mean, what most people indicated is that if they had to call to, if they needed assistance, but it wasn't a medical emergency, that they would usually have the fire department respond, and what they were looking for is something where it's not the fire department that has to come out and help you. It might be an EMT or a mental health clinician even. So that also came up. So some representative quotes I think that we heard from people was, mental health impact has been huge. People have trouble accessing information about healthcare or even providers, especially vulnerable communities. I really think that something should be done by the city. Another thing that we heard a lot was, I think Somerville should spend some of this money on expanding testing, specifically bulk ordering rapid tests and giving out to city residents to use. And then I think the city should support efforts to relieve food insecurity, such as the mobile market and growing spaces like GWS South Street Farm. So this is a pretty big umbrella of public health, and it covers a lot of things, but there were some really key themes that came up under those, in addition to sort of desire to have continued and ongoing response to COVID. So the last category that I'm going to touch on is seniors and youth. And I know that I've seen a few comments about some things that might not have come up in these categories, and I'll talk about that in just a second as well. But seniors and youth really, we've touched on a lot of things already that are connected to working with seniors in Somerville and youth in Somerville. But there was also a lot of really specific feedback that I included under this theme as well, or that we included under this theme as well, excuse me. So in sort of reading through the feedback that we got in this category, it became really clear that people who responded through our engagement really felt like youth of all ages, but also seniors, had struggled a lot during the pandemic, especially because the services and resources that they had been using had become inaccessible in a variety of ways. So, you know, with youth, that might include not being able to go into school and get access to resources that they might need through school. But for seniors, it included not having access to the Council on Aging, but also not necessarily being able to be as involved in community settings, even currently, because of the ongoing COVID pandemic, excuse me. And one other thing that I just want to mention before I get into some of the other themes is that a lot of this was really framed as urgent, especially when people were commenting about youth. So some of the themes that came out in this include providing and expanding out of school programming. So earlier I mentioned the desire from survey participants to expand childcare options. There was also a similar but different desire to expand out-of-school programming for youth, not necessarily in a childcare setting, but before school programs, after-school programs, and over the summer. And occasionally people would list off examples here, and often what that included was recreational activities or theater or arts and cultural options or summer programs for teens and high schoolers, etc. A lot of people, and this is related to one of the things that I mentioned earlier, but a lot of respondents indicated that they would support using ARPA funding to develop programs that fostered youth volunteerism and employment. And so you might remember I mentioned earlier about having youth creating a workforce development program or job training program for youth to help them, especially high school youth, help them leave high school and get into working. But also people really felt strongly about increasing the diversity of programs addressing the developmental impact, or excuse me, increasing the diversity of programming options generally, beyond the things that currently exist. And I think in particular, there were a few comments, this is just sort of a funny anecdote, a few comments that said in parentheses, more than just sports and chorus. And as somebody who did both sports and chorus in high school, I can definitely sympathize with that. It sort of dominated the services that I had accessible to me growing up. But in addition to that, people really felt strongly about expanding tutoring programs or programs that aren't necessarily tutoring programs, but that would help address some of the developmental impacts that students experienced because of the disruption the pandemic caused. And then in addition to that, programming that includes accommodations or is specific for students with disabilities to ensure that those students are able to participate in these programs as well. And then major themes, some major things that we heard with regard to providing support for seniors include improving and expanding the senior center and its programming, including some folks who felt pretty strongly that there should be a senior center that's just for the senior center and not a space that's shared with other services. We heard from a lot of residents, that, both in the survey and in some focus groups, that they were very interested in developing more programming to help seniors age in place. Instead of, but we also did hear some feedback, which I didn't include on this list, but we did also hear some feedback from folks who wanted the city to invest in more services for supporting seniors who might want to transition out of their homes and into some form of like care center or other type of service. Something that came up a lot, which is why this is one of the reasons why I grouped youth and seniors together, is that on the same slide, is that we heard a lot about developing intergenerational supports and programs that include both youth and seniors as participants, particularly where it comes to workforce training for youth, helping youth get connected to programming and be paid for it that would help them provide needed services or assistance to seniors, like snow shoveling, which I know is a program that currently exists, but expanding that type of stuff. And then improving access to healthy food, social opportunities, and transportation assistance. That's a lot all in one bullet. But really that's generally about sort of making sure that the services that are here really serve seniors the way they want to be served. And thinking about how we can reframe some of those services to best meet the needs of the people who are using them. And the types of services that people talked about in that were, access to healthy food, social opportunities, and transportation assistance. So some quotes that came up that I think are sort of illustrative of this is, really a full service senior center, a dedicated space, not necessarily shared with lots of other services. And then something that I heard also from a focus group was the Council on Aging workshops have been really great for me. I've made some great connections in this place, and being part of a group for decluttering was especially helpful. So it was really, we also heard from people about the services that exist that they really feel like they had benefited from. And then the last thing I'll just say is a comment that is kind of indicative of a lot of other comments that we got, and that is support for elementary school students who have fallen behind. So that's more connected to the youth side. So that is sort of I know that was a lot of information, and I know especially that was a lot of text. And so we have a couple of more slides, and like Emily just mentioned in the chat, we have a few more slides. I just want to highlight some additional things, and then we will get to some of the questions in the chat. I wanted to revisit some of the ARPA projects to date that Erica talked about earlier. So the ones that you see in pink on the screen are projects that the city has funded currently or is imminently funding. That were identified specifically in the themes that we found throughout the feedback. Really on the screen, the only things that participants didn't talk about was hand sanitizer in parks and funding ARPA administration, which we assume that people want to fund ARPA administration because otherwise there would be no ARPA meeting. But another thing that I guess I should have made this pink, but translation, interpretation, and printing costs for community outreach falls under that. And so we've really tried hard to make sure that our materials are accessible in that regard as well. So I know that some folks in the comments have really identified some areas where we might have been missing some key pieces of feedback. So I just wanted to go over that as well and talk about how what our plan is to sort of fill those gaps. So we've heard from a lot of people, but we also know that from the survey at least, that less than 1% of the survey respondents identified as youth and I think the percentage is a little bit higher for people under the age of 25. But that 1% is for youth who are 18 years old or younger. And then in addition to that, I actually got my percentage wrong here, but residents who don't speak English represented only 8% of the total survey respondents. And that's really one of the, besides the focus groups that we've done, where there has been participation from non-English speaking Somervillians. The survey is really the only place where we were able to collect that specific information. And then, in doing some of this analysis, I did notice with the analysis team a few key gaps in terms of content that I think we might have expected to see but didn't. And so that is arts and cultural resources and programming, but also open spaces and recreation. And I saw earlier in the chat that Greg, you mentioned environmental justice. That's definitely also an area that we haven't gotten as much feedback on as well. And then neighborhood specific development issues. So these were all things that we sort of expected to come up, but we haven't necessarily noticed them. And so we're going to keep our eye out for that and use this as a way to update our engagement going forward. So to address this, we're currently partnering with the fabulous folks at Summer Viva, who are working with us to distribute a survey, distribute paper copies of the survey that we had to both youth and residents who don't speak English. I actually have, I think, over 100 completed surveys on my desk that we still have to collate. And then we are continuing to schedule focus groups with local organizations that work in these key areas so that we can make sure that we're gathering as much information as possible. So I'm going to pass it over to Emily, who's going to talk about another one of our next steps.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christian, and giving him a break there from all the presenting. So another engagement activity that we would like to do, since the City of Somerville has a new mayor, Mayor Ballantyne would really like to form an advisory committee of residents. And so she has that opportunity to form sort of like a task force. This group of folks would be made up of residents. It would be a geographic mix. It would also, we're going to take into account sort of the engagement gaps that Christian just communicated. So really thinking about having a diverse mix of folks, both in age, sort of diverse backgrounds, social economic status, and make sure that the mayor has, some folks that you can really talk to that, live in Somerville, can speak a little bit more to the needs of the community-wide. And so this group would advise the ARPA team on analysis of information gathered. They would draft a community values statement that would be used as a way to also help make funding decisions and really just advise the mayor in these funding decisions. The committee's work will be made accessible to the public. We will make sure to report back what comes out of those discussions at future forums and online updates. The timing for the advisory committee will be sometime this spring, and the group will be brought together from the spring into the summer to hopefully again, give a little bit more detail to the needs of community members as these really important funding decisions are being made. Next slide. So we just want to make sure to end here with how can you stay involved after today? Please make sure you join the city's mailing list. We have our project website that you can visit and that we will updating with more information on how ARPA funds are being spent. If you would like to host, if you're with a local community organization and you would like to host a focus group, please get in touch with us. Or if you'd like to participate in a focus group, please get in touch with us. So you can contact Erica Hernandez. She is your Somerville ARPA specialist. And I'm gonna pass it on to Christian to close out today's forum, answering some of your questions.
Thanks, Emily. So I know we've gotten some questions in the chat, and I've actually gotten a couple of emails as well. But I wanted to just make sure that we addressed some of the questions that folks have asked in the chat. But I also want to let you know that we're going to sort of close out this forum with an optional breakout room. You don't have to participate in that if you don't want to, if you sort of like, we're inching towards dinner time. So we understand that everyone has lots of things in their life that they want to be doing. But the breakout room is really an opportunity to just ask a few more questions or connect with us as a project team. And so we'll have some MAPC and city staff in those rooms in case you have any additional thoughts. But again, those will be really largely informal. And so if you're have something else to do or are content with what you've heard so far, you're welcome to hop off. Or you can be in touch with us via email as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have a better facilitated Q&A. And I will invite the city staff who are in attendance to help us answer some of these questions. And I'm just going to get my questions open. All right. So one of the, and I just see, Lee, you asked a question that I can really specifically answer, and that is, yes, we are recording the interpretation channel, so those recordings will be made available in those languages as well. So just to be specific, Spanish and Portuguese. We had one question on rental assistance, and I know that Erica, you addressed this in the chat, but I thought I might just mention it again, and that is, you've only allocated $1 billion for rental assistance out of 77 million. Are you going to be allocating more? And as Erica mentioned in the chat, that $1 million funds is a one-year emergent rental assistance program that the city is really using to start ASAP. But certainly not limited to, like, the funding is certainly not limited to more affordable housing projects in the future. Is there anything else that you want to add about that, or? Great. And Greg, you mentioned environmental justice, maybe an unseen elephant in the room. We definitely agree that's something that we sort of heard a little bit about in the survey, but not really at the level that one might expect. And so that's definitely something that's on our radar as a gap to try to hear more information about. Alex Pyrie commented, a lack of parking at the new Somerville High School, City Hall, Library area. What could be done for people who are not keen on biking November through March in that area? And then an additional comment that that's especially relevant for teachers who can't afford to live in the city and might have to park. So I don't know, that's sort of more of a comment, and that the Somerville High School issue did come up a few times in the survey. I know it's certainly something that the city has on its radar. I'm also incidentally a community stakeholder of the Highland Street redesign project, since I live 2 blocks from Highland. So I'm very much actually really close to the high school, so I'm very much personally aware of that happening in the city as well. So Erica, is there anything that you wanted to add about that?
Not at the moment. I think these are great points, and I'll just remind that we're collecting all this information from the chat, all the great points that you guys have put in there, to make sure that gets folded into the community engagement findings as well. So thank you for noting these things.
Thanks, Erica. There was one comment that said everyone in Somerville would love a community center, and most of these categories can fit in it. Is there an amount of the $77 million that can go towards a community center? Seniors, teens, and everyone will benefit.
Thank you. So as of yet, a community center project has not been proposed, but that's certainly something that we would like to be exploring. You know, most of these projects we're going to be looking with our partners around city departments, with nonprofit organizations. We have such an active community to be considering, you know, all the groups that can come together to work on this. So even though a project has not been proposed yet, we're still early on in the project, in the proposal process. So I definitely think there's still time to see one coming through.
Thanks, Erica. One additional comment that we that was made during the public health slides was I'm curious what we're considering as expanding access to mental health services. Mental health services could be everything from individual therapy to body and movement oriented work, to accessing our creative core, to sitting under a tree. What types of things would you would be able to be considered under expanding access to mental health services?
Yeah, one of the great things about the Arpa legislation to me is that many of the uses are very broad. And so there are funding categories for mental health services, and it's pretty open what that can be. And, you know, the way that, just as you said, there are so many ways to define our mental health and well-being, that it doesn't have to fit into like the traditional box. And there are lots of ways we can be creative in funding that. And so I'd say that we're open to all of these different uses, and all of these different uses seem very reasonable to look at. And a lot of the, I would say, project specific stuff will come up later when the portal is open for groups to apply for projects. That, you know, I encourage groups to apply and be creative with those proposals. And I'll be the contact working with you to make sure that your project, you know, meets all the guidelines and has the best shot as we push it through the process to go up to the mayor for approval. So I think I hope that we can see approaches that are as varied as you mentioned.
Thanks, Erica. And then I'll also just add a couple of comments that we received relating to mental health, the public health topic area. And those were mental health with a particular attention to language and culturally appropriate treatment and support for parents for children with disabilities. And then a comment about hiring a more diverse professional providers for the city. So we got a few questions about seniors and youth when we were talking about that, and a few comments as well. So one of them was, it will be nice to have accessible spaces for young adults with disabilities to socialize. We need to have their voice be here as well. I guess that's really more of a comment than a question, but it's certainly something that came up in some of the feedback that we received as well. Excuse me. And then someone else commented, youth opportunities might include efforts that tie into health and climate change topics that relate to respiratory consequences of emissions from the highways through and by the city. So this is also connecting to Greg's and a few other people's notes about environmental justice. Pandemic health issues related to respiratory vulnerabilities tie into this. Perhaps there can be opportunities for students to work with the city and groups that focus on this. Some additional comments included, we should take a closer look at Chelsea's youth employment program through La Colaborativa. Somerville seniors need to be meaningfully involved in policy matters that affect them as opposed to just consulted. And so I think that's an opportunity to just mention a little bit about some of our additional engagement opportunities. We've already gotten some really excellent suggestions today in this forum about expanding our outreach to seniors who live in Somerville. Erica and I were able to host 2 focus groups with participants at the Council on Aging, which is where we heard some really good feedback from people. So even though the survey responses their seniors were not a significant, like I think they were less than 10%. I don't remember off the top of my head, but we have engaged with seniors through a couple of other focus groups, and we're certainly planning to expand that and do more. All right. I think we've had a few additional questions. I see we have something in the chat about that has been translated by one of our interpreters, Danielle, and that is, I hope we can have another workshop with you. It's already shown that Latinos don't use online surveys much. Face-to-face is more accessible for this community. Yes, Erica and I very much agree with that, and we're very interested in continuing to expand our reach beyond just the survey. It's one of the reasons why we're so lucky to have Summer Viva as a partner in this process, because they've really helped us expand the paper survey reach into residents who don't speak English, and we're certainly looking to continue on that path as well. All right, so I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything major, and that is, we heard one comment about much more extensive outreach to immigrant communities of faith would probably boost those numbers. That was a suggestion made earlier in the chat. Certainly that's also something that we have on our in our list of activities to expand into in order to flesh out some of our engagement gaps that I mentioned earlier. And then I think actually that might be all of the questions that we've received in the chat, although I know that there's been a few things coming in since I stopped looking at the chat. So one of them is, while Somerville public housing near I-93 is state administered, residents there are most vulnerable to highway pollution. Is there anything that the city can help to do to alleviate that?
The sort of complex ownership question, and I know there's a lot of history there around thinking about the highway and the noise barriers and the lack of movement from, well, I guess I'll say the lack of ownership on the city side, really brings down what we can invest in on the highway, but there are lots of other opportunities. And I know coming from a public health background, I've been so interested in some of the work that Cafe and others have been doing, and STEP, and thinking about opportunities for air pollution mitigation and particulate matter, and the connectivity to COVID and lung respiratory health, et cetera. So definitely, of interest. And again, really comes down to who is available to manage and propose a project to address that. And in this particular case, as you said, really a land ownership sort of question. So I think there's a creativity there that has to happen of pairing intervention with, what's possible, and then, who will own the project. And as much as like I'm excited about all of these items that are coming through, as well as, projects that have been already proposed or in process, our team can't manage or enact the project. We're just making sure that groups have who specialize in these areas have everything they need to be successful in proposing and hopefully having a project accepted. So I look forward to working with anyone who wants to propose projects in any of the areas that have been mentioned so far.
Thanks, Erica. I'll also just note that MAPC has also been involved separately, not related to this project, in the cafe work. So our public health department has participated, has participated in that. I have gotten a few DMs. I'll make sure to respond to those. But I also am noting that we've had a few more comments, but we're also 5 minutes until 7:30. So I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to close out before I hold all of you beyond your dinner times. So I'm happy to stick around and communicate with people. I'm going to add my email into the chat, but also I'll add actually, Erica, can you add both of our emails into the chat so that I don't have to do that while I'm talking? That'd be great. Please reach out to us so that we can get stuff scheduled with you, because we've gotten a bunch of DMs sent directly to us about additional outreach options. That would be great. So what I'm going to do now is give us the opportunity to go into breakout rooms if you're interested in more discussion, and we'll stick around in these for maybe 15 minutes for folks, so we're not keeping you too late. So that would give us until probably 7:45. So in order for us to do this, because I want to make sure that folks who need interpretation also have access to the breakout rooms, what we're going to do is I'm going to create some breakout rooms, and then I'm just going to put people, MAPC and city staff in there, and some people in there, participants in there as well. If you need interpretation, do not accept the breakout room invitation. What we're going to do is ask you to stay in the main room so that we can continue providing interpretation through the interpretation channels. If you are an English speaker and would like to participate in the interpreted space, what you would need to do is actually access the interpretation by clicking on the globe that is down in the bottom toolbar and selecting English, and that will give you the ability to participate with all of the other people in the Portuguese and Spanish channels. So without further ado, I'm going to create 2 breakout rooms. And I'm just going to make sure that—
Christian, while you do that, I just want to make sure people know that we are recording tonight's session. We did record people's questions and comments, and we are partnering with Somerville's local cable access TV station, and they will be posting the recording on their website as well, and streaming it, I think, through their local cable access station. So for folks to know, this is a good presentation, I think, and recording to pass along to anyone you know that may be interested, that was not able to attend tonight's meeting. Please feel free to pass along the information that all of this will be accessible after today. I'm just giving Christian a moment here to organize the breakout rooms.
Yes, thank you so much. So again, if you are here and you'd like to participate in a breakout room, but you need to have interpretation, when you get the request to join a breakout room, what you'll need to do is just actually ignore that request and stay in the main space of the room, so that way you can still have access to the interpretation. All right. So I just want to make sure that everyone has a space. And I'm going to open the rooms now. And off we go.